What is up, everybody, and welcome back to the next portion of our Tekno EB48 2.2 build. This time we're going to be doing the shocks, so we're going to combine both this bag and our rear shock bag. So of course they do come in two different bags for front and rear, so bag L and M are going to be compiled into this one video here. Starting out, of course, with just getting everything set out in front of us, organized, getting everything cut off of the different parts trees, and making sure that there is, of course, no flashing or anything on any of those inserts, or else they won't sit nice and flat inside of your shock body. Now we're gonna go ahead and get started here with the actual build portion of it. And I like to start with just getting the piston on top of the shock shaft itself. So you can see that is what we are working on here. And in this case, I did decide to do an MIP 6-hole piston opposed to just the kit factory 4-hole piston that it comes with. And the reason for that is just because I'm just a bit more familiar with the 6-hole end of things. So I figured that since I'm changing up cars, I'd at least keep the shocks in a more consistent state to what I'm used to. And as you can see in the video itself, I am finagling and failing with getting it all mounted up in there. They are a little bit tricky, and I'm just kind of a dingus because I've got the manual for it right in front of me. But we do get it set on correctly this time, so we can go ahead and get everything cranked down. And of course, you are going to want to make sure that you use some shock shaft pliers here. The reason being, of course, if you use a standard set of pliers, what'll happen is the teeth on the actual pliers themselves are going to start scoring up the shock shaft, and a lot of times it doesn't grip them super well, so even then they'll also slip on top of that, and then you can run into potentially tearing O-rings and stuff. So definitely make sure that you have yourself a nice good set of shock shaft pliers. So you can see we are getting our second shock shaft all taken care of, getting that nut tightened down on the top, and then we will be set to go to the next step. The other reason why I like doing this opposed to building the bottom pack of the shocks, the bottom pack referring to the O-rings and those plastic washers, is just because I feel like it's a little bit easier to get everything built straight with the shock shaft already inside of it, rather than kind of like if you just start pushing stuff in, they can go in crooked. So it works a bit like a guide. So now that we are ready and set to go to start getting that bottom pack of the shock built, you can see I threw the O-ring on the bottom of the shock body. I like to do that first. That way, you know, I don't have a bunch of loose stuff sitting in the bottom of the shock, and then I got to try and stretch that O-ring over. So it just makes life a little bit easier to go ahead, get that knocked out up front. So that way, all you have to do is just tighten the nut down when you are finished up. When you're building this, there are going to be, of course, 3 different plastic white washer spacer guide things. There's going to be one that is going to be kind of a wide top hat is what I like to call it. Then you'll have just a flat washer effectively, and then you'll have a more slim top hat, if that makes sense. When you're actually building it, you'll be able to see it a little bit easier what I'm referring to, but there's a couple of different offset washers, I guess you could call them. So definitely make sure that you get those in the correct orientation. The smaller top hat, the skinnier one, that'll be a little bit taller, that one's gonna go in first. Then you'll have your O-ring, then your washer, then another O-ring, and then that wider, flatter top hat washer. I hope I described that well, but at the very least, you'll also have the manual next to you to use that as a reference. And then of course, as you're putting those O-rings and stuff on the actual shock shaft itself, you'll want to put a little bit of lubrication on there. You can use something like green slime, or as you saw for me, I just put a little bit of shock fluid on it, and that allowed me to get it all nice and lubricated, so that way we're not just building the shock totally dry. After you do that, I know I'm a little bit behind on what's on the video here, but you'll throw the shock boot on, then you can go ahead and screw on your lower shock eyelet. You'll just tighten that all the way down and pop in that ball. And then we can now go ahead and get our shock collar twisted on there. Throw the nice large O-ring into it. Put a little bit of lubrication on it again, just so that way it's a little bit easier to kind of get everything threaded all the way up the shock, because of course there are plenties and plenties of threads to go through. And then of course, while it's on the car itself, you want to be able to twist the collar without also twisting the entire shock body. So it just makes everything flow a little bit smoother. Now on this one, we're gonna go ahead and do the exact same thing. I'll speed it up. You'll put oil on the shock shaft, throw the shock shaft through the body, build your bottom pack. Again, make sure you lubricate your O-rings. Make sure you get that O-ring on the bottom of the shock body as well. Then you'll twist that lower cap on, get that nice and tight on there. Do your shock boot, twist on your eyelet, pop the ball in the eyelet, and then here we are ready again to throw some oil into the shocks. Oh, and then I also, while it was speeding up there, I didn't mention, you do that collar, that nice big collar once again, and make sure you get some lubrication on that. Now that the shocks themselves are actually built, you'll fill it up to the top, and then I like to pump the shock like 15 or 20 times. Definitely don't be afraid to pump it a bunch, just because there will be a bunch of air in it, just because it's the very, very first build. Everything is still relatively dry in the grand scheme of things, and we'll do the exact same process for both of our front shocks. While our shocks are bleeding, we can kind of do the rest of our finalization stuff, which is get the O-ring in the shock cap itself. And that, of course, is what's going to seal the cap for our emulsion style or bleeder style, whatever it's technically called, shock build setup. So we got that O-ring in there. Then we can go ahead and pop our plastic inserts into the caps themselves. And the way I like to do this is I like to have them as technical opposites of one another. That way, when I bolt the shocks on the car, the inserts are on the same way, but the little set screws that you'll use to bleed the shock will both sit on the very, very inside. I like to do that just so that way I don't get dirt or anything onto on the head of the shock. That way, it's just easier to get in and out anytime you need to rebleed shocks. You're less likely to strip it, and it just overall makes life easier. Then next thing that we go ahead and do is take those little screws that I'm telling you about right now, and then just getting the O-rings on them. That way, again, once we're ready to finalize our build here, it's just already ready to go, and I can throw that screw straight in and start the bleeding process. So you can see now, you watch the first two shocks get built. The rear shocks are the exact same setup. Nothing changes at all, other than it's a rear shock compared to a front shock. So we're gonna jump straight into our bleeding process here. I'll grab the lower portion of the body with my shock shaft pliers. The Tekno shock shaft pliers have an actual key in for the bottom of it. Take my 2.5, super duper crank that cap on there, just that way we don't have to worry about leaking at all. We'll get the bleeder screw thrown on to my driver itself. That way it's ready to go. Have a rag on standby. And this is just gonna be the first initial bleed. You'll actually bleed another time after this. And then that is to just make sure that all of the air and stuff gets out of it. So now that you've done your first bleed, you can see I'm gonna pump up the shock quite a bit, get everything kind of pressurized in there. We'll go ahead, fully extend the shock again. Then you'll take your bleeder screw out, slowly compress it with the bleeder hole facing upwards, clean off just any extra, and then you can go ahead and throw that screw back in. So, and I will do that process for each of the 4 shocks here. I will do a double bleed on each of them. That way we just get as much air out of the shock as possible, and we don't have any risk of it playing an odd factor of inconsistency while you're going around the track. So same thing here for these next 3 shocks, because it is the exact same process. I do speed it up and then inevitably cut it short there. And now that all of our shocks are bled totally dead, we can go ahead and get our springs mounted on. Now these springs here are not the kit ones. You can find which springs I'm using in the link down below for my baseline Wiggins setup that I am basing it on. And then we can go ahead and throw the cap or the lower shock cup onto the bottom of it and get our set screw put in there. And that's just gonna hold it all together. It isn't technically required, but it does make it to where that lower shock cup can't just fly off somewhere. And just like I did with those caps on top with offsetting the screws to where they'll both sit on the inside, I do the same thing with all of my lower cups, except the set screw is going to be on the outside of the shock. That way it's not rubbing on the inside of the arm at all and causing any sort of binding at all. Now that we've got all the shocks built, bled, we've got our springs on, our cups mounted, our final step, of course, is going to be to just mount it on the car itself. Now, the way that these will mount, of course, in our previous bags, we already set the upper shock mounting location on the tower, but because, of course, I need to be able to see what I'm doing, you can't see what shock holes I'm actually in at the very, very moment while I'm building it. All I do is just use the inside holes. There will be a left-hand thread and a right-hand thread screw, the left-hand thread being identified with the silver, as you can see on my front lower shock now. So both of those front shocks will be mounted on the inside position and then mounted on the already set shock tower location. On the rear, same thing. You've already set the standoffs on the car, so those are straightforward. You mount them straight on the top. And then on the lower portion of the arm, same thing as we did on the front of the car, we will have the shocks mounted on the inside location. So a little bit more stood up, comparatively speaking, to the options that you do have with this vehicle. And then we can go ahead and get our lower bolts mounted in. Same thing on the back. It's going to be a silver and a black one, silver being your left-hand thread. And that will, of course, be on the left side of the car, depending on where you're looking. And that will bring us to the end of the bag.